Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really honored to be here. This is an incredible convening. So I've been asked to speak about financing for a just transition and sort of the systemic impediments we are up against, the structures that we are in. So I would start by saying that, financing for a just transition involves two central dynamics among many others, but I'll just center in on these two: ecological and climate debt as one area, in conjunction with the south to north financial drain, otherwise also known as unequal global economic exchange, both of which operate through past colonial to present imperial time and space. What is ecological debt? It's the extraction of resources, incalculable environmental impacts from colonial era to current day carbon colonialism that is commodifying and financializing land across the south through dispossessing indigenous marginalized communities of their rights, land, and livelihood. So it's still very much at play today. It's not just a historical conjecture. Climate debt points to how developed countries, in particular the United States, as the economic hegemon, are responsible for 3/4 of historical emissions, as well as excessive global consumption, constituting less than 20% of the world's population. The North has absorbed, the former colonizer countries, or the global North, has absorbed the vast majority of carbon emissions and consumptions. Therefore, climate reparations is not charity or aid, but a moral obligation to repay historical and current debt. The massive transfer of wealth from south to north is not just part of a long legacy of financial extraction through colonial plunder and mass enslavement that has deprived the South of capital and resources, distorting economies away from diversified production and self-sufficiency to a chain of dependency that is structurally embedded in various production systems. But we also need to look at the examples of the current moment in imperial tax and debt architecture. Corporate tax avoidance and trade misinvoicing has led to approximately 7.8 trillion siphoned out of the developing world into tax havens in the decade between 2004 to 2013. This is just a decade. And where it comes to interest payments to creditors from the chronic debt condition of the global south, the chronic debt problem, we are talking about over 4 trillion or about 4.2 trillion in interest payments since 1980. This is just to share some basic examples of the colossal financial transfers that intensify inequality, deepen material deprivation, and lead to a loss of the public financial resources, but also the economic articulation, the economic resilience that could otherwise be spent on financing not just basic needs, but the right to development, the needs of a just transition, fulfilling the economic and social rights of people. So let me focus now on the key nexus between climate reparations and this financial drain, which is the vicious cycle between debt and climate. We know today the global south is in a historic debt crisis. 60% of low-income countries are in debt distress. Foreign debt payments from the south have increased by 120% between 2010 and 2021. So this is in large part due to the pandemic's urgent financing needs, but also we see an aggressive intensification of the leverage of debt as a central tool of colonial to imperial extraction. Within these payments, almost half of payments from the global south are to private lenders, making it much harder to restructure or cancel given the intransigence of private creditors, the vast majority in the financial markets in City of London and New York City's Wall Street. Debt payments amount to approximately 25% of total government spending across all developing countries. It is double that of education, 9.5 times that of health, 13.5 times that of social protection. And for the small group of countries that are reporting annual climate spending, it is 32 times greater than climate spending, 32. According to the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and World Bank, two neocolonial institutions that have orchestrated the very construction of the indebted state across the South, the poorest countries today spend more of their public budget on repaying debt than at any point in the past 3 decades. These debts are not simply bad in the abstract. They have a real human cost. every dollar spent servicing debt is a dollar not spent on public health, clean energy, improved sanitation, or any of the myriad public services and energy and industrial transition needs required for the just transition. These costs, we need to remember, are heaped on top. They are layered following 500 years of plunder, genocide, and ongoing resource extraction, now compounded by the crises, the emergency of climate change, where 1.5 degree threshold from the IPCC has long been, has already been crossed in the last several months. So these are the costs for which the South is owed climate and economic reparations in an intertwined, inseparable manner. We cannot anymore separate climate justice from economic justice. The climate crisis, in a nutshell, is not possible to address without debt and economic justice. The material and the way in which this vicious cycle works, I want to flesh out in just one way. The material and monetary losses caused by climate catastrophes trigger debt crises, in large part because 70%, according to UNCTAD, according to the UN, 70% of climate financing is in the form of debt creating loans, with little fiscal space left after the debt payments are regularly making, as I just outlined, approximately 25% of the public budget. Countries have little option but to accept further debt-creating loans by creditors and institutions. Lending to deal with climate disasters is like pouring gasoline on fire. Meanwhile, the Civil Society Review, endorsed by 166 civil society networks worldwide, estimates annual financial loss and damage from 2030 onwards at approximately $400 billion per year for the South, with total financial losses reaching $700 billion. So why do these climate vulnerabilities make it costlier to borrow? Well, in large part because the three monopoly credit rating agencies, Standard & Poor's, Moody's, and Fitch, have since 2014 integrated climate risk susceptibility as a form of debt risk in their sovereign ratings. Higher borrowing costs means even greater debt, in a true vicious cycle, resulting in the weaker ability to respond to the climate emergency. This means the South will have decreasing domestic resources available to invest in financing a just transition due to the debt crisis, with even less resources to deal with emergency climate. So within this cycle, racial capitalism and intersectional inequalities, in particular gendered inequalities, mean that women and the racialized minorities get hit the hardest. And in this way, we really see how women in the global South, who are more dependent on natural resources for their livelihood, are on the front lines of the climate threat. In the so-called least developed countries, 79% of women report agriculture as their primary source of livelihood, relative to 48% worldwide. So ways forward, I'm just going to outline a few ways forward, most of which have been talked about before, so I won't go in. A key way forward, of course, is all the calls for debt justice that the global debt justice movements have been making. What are some of these calls? Well, first and foremost, a binding and credible debt workout mechanism within a multilateral framework. This has been a long-standing call, not just by economic justice networks. 134 developing countries within the UN General Assembly have passed resolutions in 2013, 14, and 15. So consistent emphasis on a debt restructuring mechanism and to address also unsustainable and illegitimate debt. And this is referring to the debt accrued by corrupt rulers, and we see this all over the world today. But in light of how, when it comes to the debt restructuring solutions, we keep coming back to a more systemic question. And that leads us right back to the larger international financial architecture. And again, how the financial architecture is continually creating the indebted state through the nexus of dollar hegemony, free capital flows, which means the taboo against regulating financial flows, as well as the market discipline that is exerted by financial markets. By market discipline, we're talking about the withholding of access to credit, and we're talking about the compliance or the subordination of many South governments to, not just repaying debt, but to maintaining low inflation levels, low fiscal deficit levels, and a 60% normative rule on the debt to GDP ratio. And these are rules, this is a fiscal rule book that is arbitrarily created by the European Monetary Union's Maastricht Treaty, which is then universally applied in great measure due to the International Monetary Fund internalizing the rules that are coming from the North. This is a clear example of economic imperialism and how Eurocentric models get imposed globally in very arbitrary ways without any economic justification. There is no actual theory to back up most of the rule book. Ways forward involve this sort of a fiscal justice approach and campaign that is very much in synchrony with delinking in the tradition of the political decolonization movements of the new international economic order. This sort of delinking involves really challenging the metrics and assumptions of neoclassical monetarist models, challenging GDP as the singular metric, challenging debt limits and debt sustainability in their calculations, and also questioning these internalized, invisibilized assumptions that govern our global economy. I'll give you 3 examples. Crowding out the fact that public spending and public investment crowds out private spending. There's no truth to this pudding. There is no proof. There's no proof to this one. Time and time again, we see quite the opposite. Public investments actually bring in private investments. There is no simplistic binary here. Another assumption is one called the net savings generation, in that net savings is important to show market confidence. And of course, we have the internalization of sound macro policies, such as that I described, of low fiscal deficit levels and controlling inflation to an absurdly low level of 2%, in much part through the central bank independence mantra. Tax is a huge one for mass-scale redistribution and equity. We're talking financial transactions tax for global wealth redistribution, as well as progressive taxation on wealth and income, including income from capital, profits, financial assets, inheritance, property, and land. At the center of this is the ongoing negotiations happening right now in the UN General Assembly for a universal intergovernmental UN tax body that includes all countries in an equal way, that addresses the tax abuse by multinational corporations. This is the 7.8 trillion I mentioned that was siphoned in the decade from 2004 to 13. So I conclude with also making a call for this imperative to decolonize the hegemonic singularity of neoclassical economics. There are so many other plural, diverse schools of economic thinking. At least 9 other major schools can be considered to decolonize economics, including feminist, heterodox, ecological, Marxist, Keynesian, structuralist, where neoclassical economic theory says that societies are made up of rational and selfish individuals, risk is calculable, choice, exchange, and consumption are most important, and the free market would automatically correct inefficiencies. Structural, feminist, ecological economics says societies are composed of gender unequal class structures. The world is complex and uncertain. The most important domain of economies is care and human welfare. The beating heart is the financing and the resilience of public systems and public services, and the state must use proactive fiscal policy to redistribute wealth, diversify economies, create decent work opportunities, and protect local and small businesses. So with this, I conclude that the imperative for financing a just transition is really about a structural and systemic delinking for people's sovereignty, and we can hark back to the formation of the new international economic order in the political decolonization era They imagined new institutions. They configured different relationships between countries, and they had a coherent politics of reparations rooted in the concept of sovereign equality, in that equality among sovereigns is about correcting the historical colonial drain and unequal exchange. And so sovereign equality means the reflected today in the climate principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. So the way in which they practiced an anti-colonial tradition of world making, the just transition is essentially and ultimately a struggle of anti-imperialism, which necessitates the advancement of an internationalist reparations and delinking agenda in this tradition of world making. Thank you.